these imperialist coup plotters in the US State Department, they really do think that they control the entire world. They really do think that the entire world is their collective property, and they are trying to destroy China. And that's not hyperbole. Here is another development, the latest. This is becoming part of my weekly streams, the latest in the US new Cold War on China. Here is an article in NBC which shows explicitly that the US is not only waging economic war on China through sanctions, but it's waging a technological war on China to prevent China from being able to innovate, as it says. Here's an article in CNBC, quote, US needs to work with Europe to slow China's innovation rate, says Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. So the US Commerce Secretary says the US will rally allies in order to mount pressure on the Chinese economy. It's actually the world's largest. They say it's the world's second largest because they can't accept that the US has been outpaced. Quote, if we really want to slow down China's rate of innovation, we need to work with Europe. And the Commerce Secretary met alongside Secretary of State Blinken and U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, and they're going to be holding inaugural U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council, that meeting in Pennsylvania, and they're going to talk about how they can work together with their loyal imperialist allies in Europe, like the one I just showed in Spain, who want to recolonize the rest of the world in order to work together to wage economic war on China. So I just want people to remember this. When the Biden administration claims it doesn't want a new Cold War, when the U.S. government claims that its sanctions don't impact actual Chinese people and only impact the government, well, they're explicitly trying to sabotage the Chinese economy, trying to sabotage the Chinese tech sector, and basically trying to underdevelop the biggest country on earth. It's an example of how imperialism is not just about exploiting natural resources and exploiting labor in the periphery in the global south. It's also about de-development. Washington and Brussels don't want countries in the global south to develop, to have technology, to be independent, because they want to control those countries. So at the end of the day, as much as these Western capitalists talk about so-called competition, they don't want competition from China. They don't even want competition from their own so-called allies like they did to Japan. The US helped play a key role in sabotaging the Japanese economy by forcing Japan to move away from its export-dependent, manufacturing-based economy to an economy based on the service sector and consumption, and imposing neoliberal reforms on Japan, which is still militarily occupied by the US. This is the US goal and Europe's goal, to continue their hegemonic domination of the planet. They talk about competition to justify neoliberal privatization and all these structural adjustment policies, but they don't actually want competition. You can see that with how they've tried to destroy Huawei. So this leads us to other latest developments in the US-European war on China. This is actually pretty hilarious because Britain is a very minor military power. No one is afraid of the British military. But like the Spanish colonialists I began the stream with, the British are really desperate to bring back their empire. And this is an article in Reuters about how Britain was doing military exercises through the Taiwan Strait, sending through a British warship. China strongly condemned Britain for sailing a warship through the sensitive Taiwan Strait. The article pointed out that the US, on a nearly monthly basis, sends its warships through the Taiwan Strait as a clear threat to China. And now Britain, an insignificant military power, is also sending its warship through the Taiwan Strait to threaten China. But if China as so much as criticizes US foreign policy, Western corporate media portrays China as the aggressor. while the US imposes sanctions and tries to prevent China from importing oil from Iran and tries to destroy the Chinese tech sector and imprisons Chinese tech officials and sends its warships through the Taiwan Strait. And this brings me to John Bolton, the war criminal who will never die, who will never go away. So here, this week, CBC, Canadian regime media, John Bolton, to talk about why China poses a, quote, existential threat to the West as a whole through the rest of this century. Now, the implications of this comment are obvious. If you believe China is a, quote, existential threat to the West of the whole through the rest of the century, the only way to stop it is war. This is what John Bolton is explicitly calling for: war on China. This is, of course, for people who don't know, one of the most blood-soaked war criminals on earth, a just maniacal neoconservative who was one of the architects of the Iraq War, who was involved in the project for the new American century, along with the key neoconservatives in the George W. Bush administration, who not only oversaw the invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, but also planned to do similar military occupations of multiple countries in the Middle East and North Africa. John Bolton has been a key part of their gang, their criminal gang of warmongers. Here he is on Canadian regime media calling for war with China. And listen to how biased the presenter, the host is of this media outlet that is portrayed as Canadian liberal progressive media. There's nothing progressive about it. There is definitely something liberal about it. It's liberal imperialism. But listen to this imperialist propaganda from funded by the Canadian government featuring one of the worst war criminals in the world.
Okay, so you want to talk about the next time, and I think that it's important for us to talk about, as you say, the next 5, 10, 20 years. So we look at China, human rights abuses, dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong, territorial expansion, threatening Taiwan, South China Sea. It is a long, long list, and some of it extends into North America with
so absurd. I mean, again, this is a so-called journalist. He might as well be working for the Canadian government if he's not at a secret Canadian intelligence asset, because CBC is, I'm sure, thoroughly infiltrated by Canadian intelligence, if not US intelligence as well. But I mean, he just sounds like the State Department or the Canadian government just listing all of this ridiculous accusations against China. One, human rights, hilarious coming from Canada, where just a few weeks ago, there were dozens of media outlets reporting, mainstream outlets reporting about how basically every single Catholic church in Canada is a graveyard for Indigenous children who were taken away forcibly from their parents, who were often killed, and then were forced to assimilate to Christianity and white supremacist culture. And a lot of these children were tortured in horrible psychological ways and even physical ways, and mistreated and abused and died. So Canada talking about human rights, talking about Hong Kong, where Canada and the US and Western Europe tried to do an unsuccessful color revolution, talking about Taiwan, even though the Canadian propagandist here claims China is threatening Taiwan. Meanwhile, as I just showed, even Britain is sending its warships through the Taiwan Strait, which last time I checked is nowhere near the coast of Britain, but it's very close to the coast of mainland China. And the US on a monthly basis sends its warships through the Taiwan Strait, which is on the other side of the planet. Imagine if China was sending its warships through the Gulf of Mexico. But of course, it would never do that because the US is the world's dictator and it can do whatever it wants. So anyway, let's listen to more of this ridiculous propaganda from Canadian regime media.
Threatening and harassment of diaspora and the theft of intellectual property. All of these things are going on. What does the Western world need to do in a united fashion now, understanding that China and the Western world have extremely integrated economies?
Well, I think there needs to be.
I just want to point out how that is like there's this idea of a leading question as a journalist. A leading question is where you ask a question in a certain way where you know what the answer is and you want the interviewee to respond that way. That was one of the most ridiculous leading questions you can imagine. It's so obvious that it's just a softball question for this neocon.
The world have extremely integrated economies.
Well, I think there needs to be a realization that China poses an existential threat to the West as a whole through the rest of this century.
Again, I'm going to play that again because think about the implications of what he's saying. Think about what this would mean for the prospect of world war.
There needs to be a realization that China poses an existential threat to the West as a whole through the rest of this century. And it certainly is the case. It will.
If you truly believe that, then the solution is a world war. He's calling for war. He wants World War III. After the great, marvelous success of 1 million dead Iraqis with their blood all over his hands, and countless other wars that this neocon has supported, and not only supported, but helps orchestrate as a key U.S. official. Let's not forget, he worked in the Bush administration and was at one time a major ambassador and was trying to be ambassador to the UN again. And he also, in the Trump administration, which claimed that it wanted to challenge these neocons, but then Trump appointed him, the arch neocon, as Trump's top foreign policy official, the national security advisor. So anyway, I'll keep going. I'll stop talking. This is him speaking more.
And certainly is the case. It will be more rigorous to deal with China than it was to deal with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And so we should all ask ourselves whether freedom is going to be worth some additional cost to deal with the Chinese problem.
So this is absolutely incredible. He's saying that it's going to be harder to deal with China than it was the Soviet Union. So he's saying that the first Cold War is going to be child's play compared to this new Cold War or this new straight up hot war. He's saying, again, think about the implications of what he's saying. It's going to be harder to deal with China now than it was with the Soviet Union. The US waged a Cold War on the Soviet Union for nearly 50 years, for over 40 years. And think about how many hot wars there were in the Cold War that were proxy wars. The war in Afghanistan, the war in Vietnam, the war in Korea, the genocide backed by the CIA, by the US in Indonesia, the countless massacres and assassinations and terror plots against the Congo, against Cuba, against countless other countries. And he's saying now that what the US did in the first Cold War against the Soviet Union is going to be weak child's play compared to what it's going to have to do now in the new Cold War and potentially hot war against China. I'll play a little bit more.
I think we've just actually had an excellent demonstration of a step that could be emulated in other respects with the announcement of the AUKUS project, a strange acronym, but Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
Even neocons like him who want war in China think it's a weird acronym, but a weird name. But anyway, here we go.
To help Australia build 8 nuclear-powered submarines, hunter-killer submarines that can be used in the Indo-Pacific. I think this is the kind of signal to China that we should seek to do more of. I think we just saw in Washington on Friday the first in-person meeting of the heads of state of the Asian Quad, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. That's another step. I think that.
So, all right, I can't bear seeing the face of that war criminal anymore. A few implications of what he said. He said AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US Imperialist Alliance for War on China, is a good step. And he said the Quad, which is not yet a military alliance, it's an informal alliance against China, that is, bringing together the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And now, specifically, he mentioned the 8 nuclear submarines that the US is providing Australia. Now, Australia, the military doesn't really have the capabilities of operating that because Australia is not a nuclear power and does not have nuclear powered submarines. In fact, all of the countries in the world that have nuclear powered submarines also happen to be nuclear countries, which is a sign that this would be a major foot in the door to giving Australia nuclear weapons. I've talked about that in my previous streams here at Rockfin. You can check those out. But think about the implications. He's praising this military alliance, which is leading to a further nuclearization of the Pacific region, which might, as I've talked about, inspire Japan, where there are right-wing ultra-nationalist elements who are trying to also remilitarize and get nuclear weapons. It might inspire Japan to nuclearize, which might also inspire South Korea to get nuclear weapons. So this could lead to nuclear proliferation in the region. And John Bolton, this war criminal, is saying that that's a good step. That's a positive step. More nuclear technology in the Pacific region for a potential nuclear war with China. And he's making it clear that he wants a war with China. Whether or not it's a hot war or a cold war, we don't know. I mean, but it's explicit that he wants a cold war because he's saying that it's going to be harder than it was with the Soviet Union. So I know I talk about this every week. It's become part of my weekly stream. Every week I talk about some of the latest developments in the new Cold War in China. But I think it can't be more important because, I mean, look what we're talking about here. The potential for a nuclear war being pushed by the very same architects of the Iraq War. And I think a lot of people, in the lead up to the Iraq War, a lot of people assumed that it could never have happened, that it would be too crazy for the US government to wage war on Iraq. But the neocons in the Bush administration did it. They did it thanks to people like John Bolton and others.